Casting 5110 fast or 5130 fast silicone into a 590 AccuCast alginate mold. In this video, we're going to show the process of creating a prop hand using either the 5110 fast or the 5130 fast silicone. Now, both of these are new fast formulas of the popular 5110 and of course 5130. But the 5110 is a soft, fast-setting silicone that's low viscosity and can be poured directly into an alginate mold, as well as the 5130 fast, which can also be poured into an alginate mold. So pause this video, grab a cold drink, and then follow along as we show how to cast a realistic copy of a human hand using an AccuCast 590 alginate mold. Now to begin, we're going to be securing one of our mold tubes to a piece of cardboard or foam core like we're doing here, but this is a 5-inch by 12-inch mold tube, and we sell these for mold making applications, but they also work incredibly well for simple hand molds like this. This is what's typically referred to as a poured mold or a dump mold, where we fill up a bucket or a container with alginate and then plunge the subject's hand into that mold. Now the first step is to apply a small amount of petroleum jelly release to your subject's hand. In this case, I'll be using my own hand. And the main reason for this is not so much to keep the alginate from bonding to your hand, but more to ease the friction of your hand coming out of that mold. Because with a hand mold like this, you are going to be pulling your hand out of your wrist, and you don't want to accidentally rip the alginate mold. So just a little bit of Vaseline on your hand helps it not rip that alginate. And real important to make sure you're using fragrance-free petroleum jelly so you don't wind up with any potential contaminants for your silicone. Now what I'm doing here is just checking the tolerances on this mold tube to make sure I have plenty of room around my hand to make the mold. This was a tube that had been squashed, so we couldn't sell it, but it fit perfectly around my man hand, so I'm going to go ahead and use that to make the mold. Now ready to measure out how much alginate we're going to be using. Now to do that, I'm just going to pour it up roughly to the level of the final mold. And this is 590 AccuCast alginate. And 590 means it has a 5-minute working time when we use 90-degree water temperature. Now, once I've measured out my alginate, it's important to remember that alginate is very absorbent and will absorb a lot of water. So even though that looks like a lot of alginate, remember that that will absorb almost the same amount of water when it's all mixed together. So we're not going to wind up with double that volume once we mix the water into it. So that's a good way to figure out exactly how much dry alginate you need. And I like to use a little bit more water than dry alginate for this kind of dump mold because I like this to be a little bit more runny consistency. If you mix this to the manufacturer's specs, you'll wind up with a very thick alginate, which is perfect for face casts and layup casts like partial torsos and that sort of thing. But for a dump mold like this, I like this to be a little bit runnier consistency, just so it's a little bit easier to get into the detail of a hand. Now, two things to notice here. I'm pouring the water into the alginate, not the other way around. The other thing is you'll notice I didn't pour all of that water into my dry alginate. Now, first off, the main reason I'm pouring the water into the alginate and not the other way around is alginate is very low density and will want to float. So if you do it the other way around, you're going to waste a lot of valuable mixing time trying to get the alginate to go down to the bottom of the bucket. So real important detail there, just to minimize that extra mixing, just dump the water into your dry alginate. Now I'm using my hand here just because many of you starting out, that's what you're going to have available is your two hands to work with. But of course you can always use a Jiffy mixer. Just always, no matter how you mix, make sure you do it thoroughly and scrape the sides and the bottom of the mixing cup. And also very important to keep track of time. Alginate will set up almost instantly. So make sure you're keeping track of your working time and your water temperature, because if you're using warmer water than 90 degrees, that will cause the alginate to set up faster, whereas cold water will slow it down. Now, an important little note here is you'll see when you look close at that alginate that I'm putting into the tube, you'll see some little lumps in it. And those little lumps are caused by the water quality or the impurities in your tap water. So real important, you don't want to try to keep mixing to get rid of those, because those a lot of times are a side effect of various minerals in the water. So make sure you mix adequately and thoroughly for about a minute, and then get that poured into your tube and get your subject's hand into that tube. If you wait too long, it'll start to set up. Now what I'm doing here is I have my subject plunge their hand into the alginate, pull it back out, and rub that into the detail. Now in this particular cast, because I was doing myself, I got the detail of my hand really well, but not my wrist. And you'll see the difference later when we cast the silicone into the finished mold. Now, the way 590 sets, it goes through a stage where it has kind of a gelatinous quality where it's starting to set, and that's really helpful for layup casts when you're embedding cotton in the surface. But as soon as it gets to that point where we can peel it off your hand, your free hand that you used to mix, that's a good indicator that your hand is ready to demold. But I always like to make sure whatever's left on my hand has set up to a point that I can easily peel that off. And then I also check the little drips on the side of the mold tube. When those areas are strong enough to be peeled off, then I'm ready to demold my hand or the subject's hand. Now there will be a fair amount of suction. Anytime you're making a mold like this, you're basically making a custom suction cup to your subject's hand or your hand. So take care and take time to slowly ease your subject's hand out of the mold. And as you see here, I'm working my hand side to side and slowly breaking that suction. And you'll feel the air start to come in around your hand. But take your time with this step. If you rush this step, you could rip an otherwise perfect mold. So make sure you take your time and slowly ease your hand out of the mold. And now we have our finished alginate mold, and we're ready to trim it up and cast our silicone. Now here I'm just using a dental tool to remove the excess silicone around the top of the mold. Now the reason for this step is I want to make sure that extra alginate doesn't fall into that mold and mess up my silicone cast. So remove any little thin areas that could potentially fall down into the alginate mold. And then I also like to then flip that upside down, flip the whole alginate mold upside down to make sure there's no residual moisture or any loose alginate little bits that have fallen down into that finished mold. And now ready for casting. Now for casting, we have a lot of different silicones, but it's important to remember that an alginate mold like this is time sensitive. So we're going to be using the 5110 fast silicone, because remember, our alginate mold is a biodegradable temporary mold. So we need to make sure we use that and use it as soon as possible to get the most accurate cast out of the mold. So we're going to be using 5110F or 5110 fast silicone. This is a 5 Shore A, so it's soft like human skin, has about a 6-minute working time with a 1-hour demold, and has a very low 2500 mix viscosity, and of course it's 1:1 mix ratio. So we want to make sure we're all set up to cast our silicone right after we make our alginate mold, because the longer you wait, that alginate will start to shrink and distort, especially if you're working in a hot, dry environment. That alginate will really start to lose that moisture content and shrink. So be sure you're ready to cast as soon as you make your mold. Now for this cast, I mixed up 400 grams of part A and 400 grams of part B by weight. So my hand took a little bit under 2 pounds to fill my hand and part of the wrist. But you'll notice I pour a little bit extra so I have kind of a handle to pull the silicone out of the mold. Now I'm also going to be adding some silicone pigment. I just added a couple of grams of silicone pigment. And then I'm also going to be adding some of the flocking colors. And I'm going to link at the end of this tutorial to some other videos we've done on coloration. So be sure to check those out. I'll do one about pigmenting silicone and another about painting. But using silicone pigment and flocking together achieves a very realistic flesh tone, because the flocking colors, since those don't dissolve into the liquid silicone, you wind up with this mottled look that really accurately simulates human skin. Now it's important to remember that as soon as those two components go together of your 5110 fast, that the clock starts ticking. So make sure you have everything ready to go to pigment your silicone the right color. And I always like to match the flesh tone to the lightest shade of my subject's skin. So the inside of the arm is a good place to check for that. But remember that with translucent paints later on, you can always go darker, but you can't go lighter. So make sure you pigment this a little bit lighter than what's necessary for the color scheme. Now I'm adding some flocking colors. I added a little bit of green here, but also put in a little bit of yellow and red. And the flocking colors really amp up the realism on this, because since flocking is a little microfiber that doesn't dissolve, you get a very realistic look when that's all mixed together. And now ready to pour that into our alginate mold. And again, because this is so low viscosity, you can vacuum degas, and that's always a good idea. But here I wanted to show you the results you get if you don't vacuum degas. So here we're just going to pour that in. I'm filling it almost all the way up. And then I'm going to take that mold and slosh it around and look for air bubbles coming up, because especially if you're doing a hand that has some fingers that have a little bit of bend in them, you don't want to catch air bubbles in those fingertips. So rotate that mold around, move it all different ways to make sure you don't have air entrapment in your mold, and then fill it the rest of the way. And all of these steps take practice. So if you're new to this process, make sure that you're ready to start small and work up to bigger projects, because the more experience you have with both the alginate life casting process as well as mixing and pouring silicones, the better results your results will be. Now, as you might have seen in some of our previous videos, I always like to check what's in the mixing cup before I start messing with my cast so I don't accidentally mess that up. But once we've waited at least an hour, we're ready to demold our part. And again, important to remember that platinum silicone sets up faster in warmer temperatures and slower in colder temperatures, but you don't ever want to use this under about 65 degrees. And so here we're using this in about a 75-degree room, so my demold time is right at about an hour. And again, you want to take care, if you can, pull that out carefully so that you don't rip the mold, because you'll see here in a minute, if you're careful with that mold, you can use this multiple times. This is one of the advantages to using a fast-setting silicone like 5110. And of course, our final copy there has a nice little bit of jiggle to it because it has a nice soft consistency. And just for fun, we're going to go ahead and cast another copy using 5130. Now, this is for some of you who have requested a firmer silicone for hand models like this. 5130 Fast or 5130F is also a translucent formula. This one cures to about a 25 Shore A, has the same working time, around 6 minutes, and about a 1 hour demold at 75 degrees, and of course a very low 5,430 centipoise mix viscosity, and of course a 1-to-1 mix ratio. And just like the previous cast, I'm going to give more of an overview of this process because it's exactly the same. The 5130F just means fast. And because, again, this is a very low viscosity silicone and this is a pretty simple hand mold, I'm not going to bother with vacuum degassing. But again, depending on the complexity of the part and what you're going to be using these finished casts for, sometimes vacuum degassing is very important. So just be aware that will help eliminate a lot of little air bubbles in the cast if you're getting those. Now again, because of that short working time, we want to make sure we have everything ready to go. And again, our alginate mold at this point is maybe an hour and 15 minutes old, but we want to make sure we use this as soon as possible, because as that alginate mold ages, it will dry and shrink and change the accuracy of the mold. Now, I have done multiple casts in alginate molds like this. In one case, I think one time our record was about a dozen casts we pulled out of the mold. So you can get a lot of mileage out of a single alginate mold if you are careful, and if it's a simple pose for the hand. I wouldn't recommend this if you're doing some kind of crazy pose with your hand, with obviously something with curled fingertips is not going to demold as easily and as smooth as what we've got here. But be aware of that if you're careful and you have a fairly simple pose with the hand, sometimes you can get as many casts out of an alginate mold like this. But again, the main thing you're working against is the lifespan of that alginate mold. And again, as it ages, it will shrink and dry out and distort. So the sooner you use this mold, the more accurate it will be. So once again, I've mixed up roughly 2 pounds of silicone, my parts A and B mixed together, and then again I added some silicone pigment and some of the flocking colors to get that light flesh tone, and now ready to pour that into our alginate mold. And again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to pour this in, almost fill up the mold, and then slosh it around to make sure we accomplish two things: break a lot of the bubbles that tend to cling to the sides, but then also make sure that there's no air entrapment down in the fingertips. And this is low viscosity enough that for a simple pose like this, typically you don't get much, if any, air entrapment. If anything, you just get a few little micro bubbles or some kind of champagne bubbles along the sides. So depending on the purpose of your final cast, sometimes that's not an issue. For this, I just wanted to mainly just try this silicone out. This was actually my first time to use it like this, and I was impressed at how well it did just right out of the kit pouring this into an alginate mold. I got excellent results. Now, another thing to remember, and you'll see here I'm doing just like I did with the first cast. I'm demolding what's left over in the mixing bucket first, and then I pop that silicone hand right out, and you'll see that the 5130 is a little bit firmer than the 5110. So you'll see that 5110 has a fair amount of jiggle to it, where the 5130 is a lot more firm. So again, depending on the application, some of you have told us that you prefer the 5130 for hand casts, whereas some prefer the softer 5110. So again, just depends on how that's going to be used. Now I went ahead and poured yet another cast using, again, another batch of 5110, because again, that alginate mold is still good. Why not use it again? So here's another I poured up. And I think I actually poured one more hand out. I think we did about 4 hands in total. And there you have all of the hands cast in 5110 and 5130 fast silicone. And all of these are now ready for paint. Now, an important detail about painting these silicone hands. Now, the nice thing about these is they came right out of an alginate mold, so we don't have any mold release residue that needs to be cleaned off these parts. But really important to remember that platinum silicone takes paint best when it's fresh. So always make your parts when you have a plan for how you're going to use those parts and how you're going to finish these parts. But there you have a finished hand cast. You see we got incredible detail, palm print detail, fingerprint detail. You could easily frame your friends for felonies with this finished cast. And stay tuned for some follow-up videos. We're going to show a couple of different painting techniques for 5110 and 5130. So watch for that. I'll be posting that in the next few days. But there you have the process of casting realistic flesh-colored hands or other props using 590 alginate and 5110 fast and 5130 fast. Now, as always, all of our materials we use in our tutorials are available on our website, and you can find the 590 alginate in our Lifecasting supply section, as well as the 5110 fast and 5130 fast are available in our silicone section. So be sure to check that out. Those are 2 of our new platinum silicone formulas. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notified when we put out new content. And of course, check out all of our supplies at brickandtheyard.com. And thanks again for watching.